call people like you know. Ken. Okay. There you go. All right. Now you're on.
What are there? Three people I know we're talking about now. Okay, so wait, before the lights go out, and the lights go back on?
Yeah.
Okay, so where's George? So George, you need to stand up because I did this book, but I have really no engineering qualifications, no architecture qualifications, and no design qualifications. So this George Kosmaitis, who runs a company called Design Language, is basically the art genius behind not only this book, but the last book and the next book. And so he worked with me on every page to figure out what art would best display the concepts we were talking about. So the book you see, I'm the one up here giving the talk, but actually it's a total collaboration not only with George, but with a fellow named Rob, who's our researcher, who does a terrific job too. So there are really three folks who do everything to make these books happen. Okay, that's all. Just want to make sure we get George.
Can you go onto the ramp so that you're closer to your images, and that way you will be in the video that we're taking.
Oh, great. Great. So it's my first time. I haven't done this, and now you're videoing it. That's really good. Okay. So I'm going to try to keep this as close to half an hour as I can, but the book just came out, and this is the first time I'm really taking what I think are some of the most interesting pieces of it. It's not comprehensive. There's more of all of this in the book. I also don't have a forward thing, so I have to rely on hand signals. So we'll just move through it. I go pretty quickly, so can we start? Okay, so now I'm really going to go quickly, okay, because everything that's on these next 4 pages is here on Carol's wall in much more interesting format. All I want to do is literally take you from 1875. This is to the beginning of the 20th century. The next slide, please. You've got to keep up with me. Next slide is the beginning of the 20th century, and I just want to show you how the skyscrapers are getting taller. If we can stop here for a second, the Empire State Building was the tallest building. Well, these are not the tallest buildings in the world. They're just meant to show sort of what was being built in the periods when something was being built, and I really just give you this as a taste of literally some of the stuff that's here in this museum. But just to show you, this is really just to show how big buildings got. We thought these buildings were very big. This is the World Trade Center, the Hancock Building, the Willis Tower, which was the Sears Tower in Chicago. We thought they were giants. If we can go to the next slide.
It's your file size that's doing it slow, not the machine.
My file size?
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, is this a,
Yes.
how does it work? That's exactly what I need. Oh, great, just push it?
Yes, right there.
Terrific. Oh, that is great. Okay, so this is helpful. So this actually shows you how much taller. If you remember, the World Trade Center was, somewhere around here when the Petronas Tower was built. It became the tallest building in the world, taller than the World Trade Center. And then you had buildings, all of which are shown here, the Jinmao Building, the Shanghai World Financial Center, a building in Hong Kong. All of these are shown in beautiful models here. And this is the Burj Khalifa, which is today's tallest building at 2,700 feet. It's more than twice the height of the Empire State Building, which was about 1,200 feet. So we can go on. Okay, so the first few slides that I just want to take you through are one of the sections of the book, which is how you build a skyscraper. And don't think by seeing 5 slides tonight you're going to know, or reading the book you're going to know, or looking at the book, but I just want to give you a flavor of some of the stuff that goes into it. Next. This is actually a building, and Carol has a model of it. In fact, it's right there in that glass vitrine or whatever it's called, right there of the Shanghai World Financial Center, which is one of my favorite buildings in the world. And what I wanted to explain to you, this is really about the process of design. The design started really with an inspiration, in this case on the part of Bill Pedersen of KPF. And in thinking about a building in China, he thought about some sort of ancient Chinese symbols. The earth represented by a rectangular prism, and the sky by a circular disc. And in putting together, you can't really see it too well here, but in putting together the form of the building, which you do see here, it's basically a sort of an arc, a sort of prism-like arc that's reaching up from the square ground, or the earth, to the sky, which was intended to be represented by this circular disc, which would also form a sort of, a wind hole to allow some of the wind pressure to go through. So this was the original design, and the foundation was poured in Shanghai in 1997. In 1998, the project stopped because of the economic setbacks, and for 2 years nothing happened. When the project resumed, the Japanese developer, the Mori company, decided that they wanted an additional 15% of volume in the building. They wanted a bigger building, but the foundation had already been poured. So the question was, how do you adapt the building to be 10% lighter than it had been in the original design so that it could go on the same foundation, since the foundation had already been built? And they came up with a very innovative structure for the second iteration of the building, which is shown beautifully in that vitrine, which involves an outrigger system, which basically tied the core to some massive columns on the perimeter, and that allowed both the core to be thinner and lighter and the amount of steel on the perimeter of the building to be less. So it actually took the average weight of the building down and allowed it to be built on the pre-existing foundation. But that wasn't the end of the story. You'd think that would be enough, but the building was designed to have this circular hole at the top, again representing the sky in Chinese mythology. But somewhere along the line, someone in China, including the mayor of China and I'm sure other people, decided that having a round symbol which looked suspiciously like the rising sun in the Japanese flag was probably not a good thing for a Japanese developer to leave as a mark on the top of what was going to be, at that time, their tallest building. So basically, they suggested they change it, and the architects attempted not to change it because, of course, that was part of the whole original design. They thought of putting a Ferris wheel in here. They thought of putting a bridge across here, but nothing would really satisfy the Chinese concerns, so they ended up turning that circle into a trapezoid, which, as far as I know, has no real history in terms of Chinese mythology, but it actually ended up cheaper, and it allowed the wind to move through, which was functional. But it's kind of a funny look, and even though I still like the building, it's now often referred to as the can opener building, which was not at all, I think, what was intended originally. So we can go to the next slide. That's just to show you the process of design. It's not always straightforward. I show you this slide just because, as you'll see in looking around Carol's exhibition, skyscrapers the world over are not the same. Skyscrapers in the United States are built very functionally. And if you want to know about functional, you should read Carol's book, which is Form Follows Finance, about the building of the Empire State Building, and really, you know, how economic a machine, a skyscraper is. It's particularly economic in the United States. The floor plates tend to be rectangular or square, and they're very highly functional. In Europe, the floor plates, which is basically the footprint of the building, are much narrower because over there people have a right to be near a window, a certain amount of feet from a window, and also a right to, in some places, natural ventilation. So you really get very different footprints and a very different look for the building. In Asia, you see even bigger buildings with bigger cores. The core is where the sort of machinery of the skyscraper, the elevators and the plumbing are. Buildings tend to be developed primarily, they're driven by the contractors who are building these. So they're big, they're strong, and they have very different footprints to the buildings that you see in the US and Europe. So buildings around the world, although they do reference one another, will be sized very differently. Go ahead. This is a graphic that was picked up by, surprisingly enough, the New York Post right after the book came out, and it was really meant to show how much can be in a skyscraper. One of the typologies of skyscrapers today, probably half of really tall skyscrapers today are built as mixed-use skyscrapers. They're not just office buildings, which was the first type of skyscraper built. They're mixed-use, and so down here you see retail, you might see some other activities here, then you'll see some office, and typically at the top, where you see smaller floor plates, will be either residential accommodation or a hotel. And so these three are stacked on top of one another. This is actually called a stacking diagram. And what I did in the book was break it apart into the amount of land it would take to accommodate these functions, office, retail, and residential. If you were to take it out to the suburbs and you had to provide parking for each of these functions, it would take up 21 square blocks of a city, of New York City anyway, which is an amazing thing. So these are I think very efficient, very land efficient, very energy efficient, which is one of the reasons why I think skyscrapers are an urban form for the future. Go to the next slide. This is really more a fun slide. It's not really showing you how they're built. It's showing you how they're differentiated from one another, particularly in this country where it's all about what's economic and what can you rent out and what kind of floor plates do tenants want. skyscrapers like to differentiate themselves in part by their crowns. So the Empire State Building does it in light. Apparently it's all red tonight. They explained on the radio coming down what it was for, but I can't remember. So that's just the lighting. You can see some of the decorative stuff at top. Again, this is not functional. Unlike the rest of the building, the crowns of buildings are very rarely functional. In Times Square, you see signage as a way to make money out of the building. You don't even see some of these buildings. And then in some places, you see two buildings, most notably down here with the World Trade Center, which, you know, as many people thought it was an abomination when there were two of them. From an architectural standpoint, it would have been even worse if there was just one of them. And so that form is emulated not just in the Petronas building and others. This is the Bahrain World Trade Center, which has two buildings connected by sky bridges with wind turbines that are actually located on the sky bridges and are intended to produce some amount of energy. Okay, now we're on to, not sure, structure. So structure is really important when you're building a skyscraper. I like to start with this one because these are buildings before skyscrapers, really. Traditionally, in constructing any kind of multi-level building, the walls took the weight. They were made of masonry. They had to be thicker down below because that's where they were taking more weight, and they were thinner up the top. So imagine, depending on how high you wanted to go, the walls on the floors at the bottom really needed to get very thick. And eventually they would get so thick that there would be no rentable space down there. So the height of buildings with these masonry load-bearing walls was limited. What really changed the world for skyscrapers, there was several other inventions as well, the elevator and other stuff. But the steel frame, the steel skeleton, as the price of steel came down in the late 19th century, the idea of having a steel skeleton, an internal skeleton that would take the weight of a building, all of a sudden allowed buildings to get much taller because it didn't matter what was happening with the skin. The skin was pretty much decorative. Obviously, it kept the elements out, but it became decorative and it didn't need to bear any weight. So you had full, useful space on the bottom instead of an awful lot of the bottom taken up by masonry walls. So I like to show this because this is a really important concept to understand what's holding up a skyscraper. People are always saying to me, is the glass holding it up? The glass is doing nothing but keeping the wind and the water out. Just another little, structure is my favorite part of skyscrapers. That's because I'm not an engineer, so I find it so incredible that people actually understand this. But this graphic up here is interesting because obviously there's a lot of gravity load on a building, and this diagram here shows the loads moving down the columns of the building. As a building doubles in size or in height, the gravity load doubles as well. But what's really important about skyscrapers is that the most important load for a skyscraper isn't the gravity load, it's the wind load. And as the height of a skyscraper doubles, the wind load quadruples. So it grows exponentially, which is why wind is really the most important thing that designers have to think about when they're designing a building. And you can see here the pressure of the wind moves along the columns, the beams, and it has a very complicated path that it travels, but that is what's critical. And you can see that there's a terrific video that Carol has of Bill Baker, who's one of the world's foremost structural engineers in skyscraper designing, is actually explaining how you deal with wind in a tall building, and it's fascinating. If you haven't seen it, you should really see it. But Carol and I had the pleasure of Bill actually explaining to us at his desk, and Carol was clever enough to take a little video of it, and so it's there for everybody else. Next. This is something I didn't know existed. Once I figured out that skyscrapers had to move back and forth, that's part of what they're designed to do, I was curious about how far they could move and why they don't move more. And somebody explained to me that there's amazing things on top of many of the tallest buildings, which are called dampers, that are like big pendulums that offset the force of the wind in one direction to help keep a skyscraper stable. The dampers can be made of water. Picture, there's kind of a U-shaped pool of water, and as the wind pushes against the skyscraper this way, the water moves that way just as it would in the pool, and that helps keep the skyscraper from moving too much in the direction of the wind. In some places, these dampers are hydraulic, electric, mechanical. This one is actually a sort of cosmetic part of the building. On Taipei 101, there's a golden orb that's up somewhere in the 90th floor of the building, and it hangs down as a pendulum, and you can actually see it move. And it is functioning in the same way as this pool of water, but it's part of the architecture of the building. So it's very cool. Okay, next. So this is a little story that any of you who have read The New Yorker probably read. It was there about a decade ago about the City Court building. The story actually happened in the 70s when it was built. Some of you may recognize the City Court building on 53rd Street, and it has these great pillars that go about 9 stories high. There's a whole story about why it had to have pillars and a church on the block and all the rest of it. But the important thing is that it was, designed with this very, unusual engineering down here. And when the building was opened already, somebody brought to the attention of the architects and engineer on the project that they had put the wrong kind of bolts on, and they hadn't actually calculated the force of what are called quartering winds, which would come from the diagonal as opposed to perpendicular winds. And when they went back into the calculations, they realized that the building could be in jeopardy, and everybody very quietly, without telling the masses, figured out that they had to do something to shore up this building before hurricane season, because it was, July, and the hurricane season, the winds come here in September. And so they went around and put in this they called up Walter Wriston, who was running Citibank. They told him about it, and they had this whole SWAT team that did a bunch of things. They put a temporary generator in the building to make sure that the damper at the top, which worked electrically, would continue to work if the power went out. They brought workmen in at night to shore up and replace these bolts that everybody was worried about. They developed an evacuation plan in case they had to evacuate the whole building, and they put transponders on different parts of the structure of the building so they could actually monitor if something was going wrong. So the whole thing was done quietly, though, and people who were working there actually didn't know about it. And they succeeded in doing this whole, program within, a 2-month period, and the hurricane winds didn't come, and the building is still there today. But it's really interesting, and the point here is that you can actually mess up in the design and engineering of a skyscraper. Hopefully you figure it out eventually. Okay, next slide. People do ask about earthquakes. I haven't done a presentation, but I have done a lot of radio, and so I've tried to put into this presentation questions that people asked on NPR and all the radio shows, and people are asking a lot about earthquakes. And actually, skyscrapers are some of the safest buildings to be in during earthquakes, not just because they use different technologies. This is a sort of base isolation technology, which, sort of allows the foundation in the building to move and roll, to adapt to movement in the earth. These are dampers, a different kind of dampers, which are almost like big springs, which are put in different parts of the structure, which also allow the structure to be compressed and extended in response to movement. And you see these a lot in places like Mexico City. But the thing that I thought was really interesting is this chart of resonance, and I don't want to sound really technical. I'm not an engineer, but because buildings do move, they move at a certain frequency, and what's really dangerous for buildings is when the earth moves and the building is moving at the same frequency as the earth, because obviously, like a swing, it picks up momentum. And so what you found in Mexico City when it had its earthquake and other places is that buildings that are roughly between 6 and 15 floors in height have the resonance that most matches what happens with earthquakes, and as a result, they tend to sway the most, and they tend to be the ones to fall. So in Mexico City, you found that the buildings that were smaller and the buildings that were taller were fine, and the buildings in the middle weren't. So skyscrapers are not any less safe in earthquakes than other buildings. That's the point. Next. I'm not going to go into how this works, because there's plenty of other people who can talk more. People are asking about how do you keep the rain out, and the point here is really about glass and about the curtain wall on the outside of buildings, and there are a number of sophisticated technologies that actually keep water out. It's not just glass, you have little pressure chambers that can actually repel the water. You have channels that when water does get in between the glass and what's holding it, that actually take the water out, and it's a whole world of engineering that unto itself almost, which also, if we can go to the next slide, doesn't always work right. There's a couple ways that it doesn't work. This one is actually nothing against 7 World Trade Center. It's a great building. But I show you this just to show that whether a building is reflective like this or whether the glass on a building is clear, they're really very dangerous objects for birds, because birds don't see glass. So if they see something like this, they'll assume this is a cloud. And if they don't have that there and they're looking through the building, they'll assume they can go right into it. So you see bird hits a lot in these glass curtain wall buildings. And there are no programs in New York, I think Chicago and Toronto, to actually dim the lights on building at night, because at night and in bad weather, birds are particularly attracted by the light. So they're a little bit of a hazard for birds. And I think some urban places are finally realizing that actually getting rid of those lights at night is helpful. Next slide, please. This is another, like in the spirit of City Court, but this is Boston's boo-boo. This is the Hancock Tower in Boston. Some of you may remember this. I actually do remember it. When it went up, it was a beautiful IMP design building. It had this blue reflective glass. It still does. It's gorgeous. It had a lot of problems in going up, and this is in the early 70s, partly because the structure wasn't quite right and people were afraid it was going to move. And then somewhere along the line, it was being built in 1973. All of a sudden, 65 windows came out. And these windows were very unique. They were sort of only glass, and 65 of them popped out before the building opened, and they were, 500 pounds each. These are huge, great things that fell to the ground. So for a whole bunch of years, they put plywood in, and it was referred to as the plywood palace, while they figured out how to replace all the windows. And when they actually looked back to find out why they were popping out because there was actually 2 levels of glass, 2 layers of glass, and there was some air that was expanding and contracting between them, and it was actually exerting a push on the glass. And so the original design for the windows didn't work, and I think it cost something like $5 million, which in those days was a fair amount of money to replace them all, and they were all replaced. Next. Little story about men who work on steel. I should just preface this by saying I'm totally afraid of heights. I mean, I live on the 11th floor, I work on the 23rd floor, but I don't go near the windows. When I did work in the Trade Center, I was on the 64th floor, and I had a window office, but my desk was as far away as possible in the office from the window. So I don't like heights, but I'm always amazed when I look back at these pictures of steel workers who go out on beams who don't mind heights at all. And many of you have probably seen those pictures of the Indians who were out there building all of the skyscrapers in the 20s and 30s in New York. And the story that I really like is how Indians ended up on the top of skyscrapers. And what I found out in doing the research for this, I also have a friend who wrote a book about it, was that Indians were sort of hanging around in the turn of the 20th century with not an awful lot to do, post fur trade. And the Dominion Bridge Company came to an Indian reservation on the St. Lawrence River, and they wanted to build a cantilever rail bridge across the river. And the Indians said, this particular tribe, which I can't pronounce, said, we'll only allow you to do it if you put our men to work on the bridge. And the bridge company didn't think they had the skills to do all the riveting and the fancy stuff, but they hired these guys, and they found that the Indians were walking out on these steel beams, at great height in the middle of the river, had no fear, and started putting them to work doing the sophisticated riveting and various other things. 7 years later, there was a big bridge collapse, the Quebec Bridge, as it was being constructed. There weren't a lot of bridges being built, and so a lot of these Indian iron workers drifted down to New York, during which time you started having 1910, 1920, you started seeing a lot of tall buildings go up, and that was really, in part, the beginnings of having these Indian iron workers in New York. And there are still about 80 or 100 of them who still work from 2 reservations, who still work, in building the steel that's going into the buildings today. Next. Okay, so this is just a random assortment of things that I wanted to know and found interesting in the book. I was always curious about these guys who are up here all day long in the little cabs that run the big cranes. I mean, I like tower cranes to begin with, but I did wonder about their life up there, and it turns out that there's not just one of them. There are 2 guys that are up there. There's somebody called an oiler, and then there's the crane operator. But I also wondered what life was like inside that cab, and it turns out that they have heating, they have a refrigerator, they have some kind of portable toilet, I don't exactly know what it is, and they get paid a lot of money. But the money they get paid is not tied to how high they are, which is what I thought. It's tied to the length of this beam, the length of the arm of the crane, which is really kind of interesting. I think the next slide shows the actual tower crane itself, because the other thing that I had learned, which I didn't completely understand and wanted to know more about, was how tower cranes erect themselves and take themselves down. They do it on sites where skyscrapers are going up. They do it with no help from any other machines. And so I tried to explain, and George and our graphic folks tried to help me explain how they build themselves. And I really won't explain it here. It is explained in the book. Each of these graphics is in the book with a lot of subtext that explains it. But basically, this little green sleeve that you see lifts itself up, as you can see here, and another piece of the crane moves in here, gets set in place, and then again the green sleeve will move itself up again and lift another piece to be put in place. And then of course the crane is busy lifting real stuff like steel beams. But this is how it builds itself, and then it takes itself apart in situ when it's done and it moves to another job. So I think it's a pretty cool machine. Okay, next. Oh, the next section of the book is about all the services you need, because, you know, tall things have always existed, Gothic cathedrals, Roman campaniles, all kinds of things, but they never had people in them. The thing about skyscrapers that's really amazing is they're not just tall structures, they're where people live and work. So the next section of the book is all about the services that you need to keep it habitable at great heights. So I'm not sure what's next, but elevators. People in New York City like to know about elevators, and all I can say is, you know, we don't think about it a lot, but they are very, very safe. I guess the first thing I should say is that the whole way an elevator works has changed very, very little since the time Otis invented it in the 1850s. It basically works on a counterweight principle, and I think a lot of people know that. So, you know, as the elevator cab is going up, there's a weight going down on the other side, and these cables are basically balancing the weights. But there's a number of safety features, some of which we know, beams that will open it if you get involved in it. There's ways to make sure that the doors protect folks from falling down an elevator shaft. There's buffers at the bottom. But the thing that I think is most important, or that gave me the most comfort, was this electromagnetic brake. There's actually a series of teeth on the side of the elevator cabs, so that when the power goes out, if the power goes out, it's basically held in an open position by power. And when the power goes out, the teeth lock the elevator into the side of the shaft so that the cab is held in place. So the minute the power goes out, the elevator gets locked. And of course, usually in most buildings, maybe we can go to the next slide, in most buildings there's a backup generator that will come on. So you'll see if the power goes out, that this brake mechanism basically locks the cab in place, and then the power will come on because usually emergency generators are available, and then that elevator cab will be called to the ground and power shut off. Sometimes elevators get stuck, and when they do, typically if it's at a floor, firemen can use something like the jaws of life to open the door and let people out. Sometimes they get stuck between floors, but every elevator not only has egress from the normal door, but also has typically a hole in the roof that allows firemen to come in and get people out as well. Okay, so that's elevators. This is probably not interesting to most people, but I thought it was kind of interesting because obviously the air in skyscrapers needs to be changed constantly because you've got thousands of people breathing the same air. In a typical situation, the ventilation comes from the ceiling, and you know there's a drop ceiling, there's all kind of pipes moving it through that's pushing fresh air in and taking air out. In a lot of modern office buildings today, you'll see underfloor air ventilation. The air coming in, so there's essentially a false floor rather than a false ceiling, and the air comes in here, and it makes a lot more sense because this is the zone where people are and where people need air and tempered air and hot air and cool air rather than up here. And this basically allows warmer air to come through and allows people greater control over the air in their workspace. So I thought that was kind of cool. Next. Water. This is just for the New York audience because people are always asking about water tanks, and water tanks obviously have existed for a long time. Water tanks allowed, you know, all kinds of safety concerns to be addressed early on when fire was a real hazard in New York City. But typically gravity only allows water to flow to about 5 or 6 floors in New York City. These water tanks work by basically having water pumped up from the system at the bottom of the building to the top. And they're terrific structures, and they still exist, more so in New York than anywhere else. But in most skyscrapers, you may have multiple floors where water is held in what are essentially tanks. They don't look like water tanks, and they're inside of a building. And then that mechanical floor in that tank has a series of distribution outlets to various floors. And the pressure, of course, has to be controlled by a variety of valves and other outlets to make sure that the pressure on every floor is the same. Otherwise, it wouldn't be, and you'd have terrific pressure on some floors and not enough pressure on others. Okay? Fire is another thing, I guess, because there have been incidences of fire in skyscrapers, and it's a scary thing. It doesn't happen very often. It happens a lot less in skyscrapers, whether they're residential or office buildings, than in industrial buildings. But this is really meant to, for those people, particularly who work in offices, that there have to be sprinklers in commercial buildings, here in this country particularly, that are there because these buildings are often empty at night, so there's nobody there to notice a fire. So the idea of automatic sprinklers, and I won't explain how they work, but basically, you know, the heat triggers the response, and the sprinklers start sprinkling the floor even when nobody's there. In residential buildings, they're not required in residential buildings. I guess it's assumed that people are living there and actually notice when a fire breaks out. Obviously, there are standpipes that run through the building that keep the water moving so that firemen can access water if they do need to go up there. And there are also, in this city, these high-pressure pumper trucks, which are actually designed for skyscrapers, and they actually pump the water at greater pressure when it needs to come into a skyscraper situation. And I will do a very short slide on terrorism, which I don't particularly want to talk about in any great detail, but people have asked have there been changes to buildings because of 9/11 and because of other terrorism. I'm just looking down here at the bottom of the building, not at the various changes in structure all the way through, and in terms of the core and the elevators and the stairways, there's lots of other changes as well. But just in terms of some of the lower parts of the building, which you really see over here in the new One World Trade Center, we've all seen standoff bollards that keep vehicles away from buildings. This is a function not just of skyscrapers, but it's happened at embassies, U.S. embassies around the world. You see different framing technology to make the building secure and different reinforcements of the floor slabs to make them more stable. And you also see a hardening of the facades. I mean, this World Trade Center building that's going up over here is built like a fortress. The bottom 6 or 7 floors are almost unpenetrable. So there have been a lot of changes in response to terrorism. Next. Oh, window washing. This is, again, for anybody who's scared of heights, the idea of going out with this little harness and being over the city like this and washing the windows, which is, of course, how they did it for years, is terrifically scary. If we go to the next slide, you can see how they do it today. There are still people, and you see them sometimes outside, but typically they're lowering themselves on a much more sophisticated type scaffold or davit from the top of a building so they can wash the windows. There are also, on some buildings, not many, automated creatures that go by that wash the windows, which I find really, really spooky. And there's lots of different ways that these things are hung from buildings. I like this picture. This is the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, because you can see as building facades get more complicated, the whole idea of washing these windows, certainly you can't do it in an automated way, but you have to develop very clever technology and very clever type arms to hang your window washing equipment from to even get to some of these windows. Okay. So now we're just going to talk about the future a little bit. The first piece I wanted to talk about was sustainability and energy, because people are very interested in green buildings. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in researching skyscrapers is that the older buildings were much more energy efficient than the newer buildings. So why were they more energy efficient? They're more energy efficient for a couple of reasons. The main reason is they don't have as much glass, sort of intuitive. Only about 20 or 30% of their facades were glass. So they really were thermally very well insulated. That, of course, changed in the 1950s, 1960s with the international style. You started getting these glass buildings, and all of a sudden you couldn't open the windows, and you had a lot of glass, which did make for more daylight in the building, which was sort of nice, but it also meant that you lost an awful lot of heat and had to air condition everything because you had no ventilation. What you're seeing now is buildings that are meant to attract daylight in a way, so take advantage of the idea that glass can bring daylight in, but also try to be a little more thermally protective so that you're not losing as much heat, and you're doing different things with the air in between the panes of glass to try to keep some of that, the tempered climate within the building. Next. I like to show there's lots of things. I'm not going to go through all the green technologies in buildings because it would probably get boring and is a little complicated, but I picked this building just because it's around the corner here, the Visionaire in Battery Park City. It was designed by Raphael Pelle, who also happens to be a friend, but it shows what you can do with water in a building. There's other things you can do, and One Bryant Park that Douglas Durst just built, the Bank of America building, has a number of other interesting technologies, cogeneration, and a variety of things. But I was just using this building partly because it's here and partly because water is so important. And if you look down here, you see 3 different tanks and 3 different pipes. And what's real interesting here is that they're harvesting rainwater. They're bringing it into the system to be used, again, for some of the water that the building needs. They're also taking what's called the gray water, so the water that moves through the sinks in the building, and they're bringing that down and reusing that as well for toilets and whatever else in the building can use what's called gray water. And then, of course, you have a connection to the clean water main or the city water main that's bringing the water in that is going to the faucets and the drinking fountains initially. So this is sort of when people talk about water recycling, gray water is really this water, and black water is really the water that's coming out from the toilets. Okay, next. So the last few slides are just meant to show you some pictures of what's going on. You can, if you're really interested in how high, you should look at Carol's wall there, I think, because she's picked out all the buildings that by 2016 are going to be the tallest buildings in the world. I just picked a random sample of some buildings that are under construction or not under construction in some cases. The Shard is going up in London, and it's going to be London's tallest building. London and most of Europe has not been very interested in tall buildings for a whole variety of reasons, but this is a very nice building that's going up in London right now. I can't actually read. This is a Gazprom tower, which is a tower designed for St. Petersburg for Russia, which had a checkered history of being on, off, and moved a gazillion times. This Shanghai tower is being built, and Carol's got a model of that and a lot of pictures of that. It will be one of the tallest buildings in China. It's in the Pudong district in Shanghai near the Jinmao Tower and near the Shanghai World Financial Center. This one, of course, is around the corner. It's the World Trade Center, which is looking very much like a building at last. This is a Lati Tower, which is also in one of Carol's displays, which is going up in Seoul, South Korea. This is a building that is not going up, but has a foundation hole in Chicago, the Chicago Spire, which was designed by Santiago Calatrava, who's sometimes better known for his bridge structures, and also who did the PATH station that's emerging from the ground here at Ground Zero. The foundation was poured from this building right along the lake, right next to the big Trump building, and then the project was basically killed because of the economic recession in 2008, so it is a hole. This building was sort of on the drawing board, but not really, in Dubai for a while with a company called Nakheel that's a big development company and industrial conglomerate in Dubai. Maybe someday it will come back, maybe it won't. Next. How green will buildings be? These buildings along the top are all buildings that are either nearing completion or have been completed. They have various things, photovoltaics, different kind of, production of wind energy. This building, ADIC, actually has a kind of skin and windows that move around that can close and open. This building is a casino hotel development in Singapore, the Marina Bay Sands, which has a 4-acre park on the top of it. So this park is 55 stories high. It's unbelievable. It hangs over here. This cantilever is like the largest cantilever at the top of a building in the world, which is the size of two 747s. And it's got all kinds of amazing things on the top of it. So it's really a park in the sky, and this one has a lot of photovoltaics and energy-saving devices. These are all buildings that people are talking about. This was one, the Clean Technology Tower in Chicago, that was going to take advantage of solar energy and wind ventilation as well. This one in Copenhagen is meant to be a flexible building where you could use these cubes as office and as commercial and as parking. And this EDIC tower was meant to have a sort of green ecology, almost like a forest that was linked up on the outside to provide energy benefits to the building. Next. What shape will they be? Well, these buildings, with the exception of this one, are all buildings that are really out there, and all you have to do is look around the display here to see how crazy the shapes are. Part of the reason they're crazy is because not everybody is concerned about the economics of a building foremost. The economics of a building are best when a building is basically square or rectangular and is very easy, very flexible, and has lots of open space inside. These are not. This is a residential building built by designed by Santiago Calatrava in Sweden, called the Turning Torso. This is a Trump building in the Middle East. This is what's known as the Gherkin in London, which was designed by Norman Foster. This is the China Television Company's building, which is a very interesting shape, which has been built and has been in use for years now. And this is another Middle Eastern special. Most of the interesting buildings in terms of design are either in the Middle East or Asia. This was one designed by Norman Foster, I think for Moscow. Is that right? I can't remember. But it hasn't been built yet. Where are they being built? Well, they're not being built here. Let's just say that. If Chicago and New York is where skyscrapers started, and it is where skyscrapers started, there are very few very tall skyscrapers. Lots of skyscrapers going up all around the world, but the reason that what I'm talking about now fits so well with Carol's show is very tall skyscrapers are really, they either come to pass when there's a lot of money and you don't need to worry about tenants, or when the economy is very strong and people are very comfortable that they're going to be able to find tenants. And that is not the case here. You can see there are not that many tall skyscrapers going up. The tall skyscrapers are going up in the Middle East and around Asia. Lots of tall buildings going up in this country. We build tall, as a matter of routine. But really tall skyscrapers require a certain amount of economic confidence or a certain depth of pockets that most developers in this country don't have. Okay, I think we're up to the last slide. This is just to sort of show you some kind of fun height diagrams. This, of course, is the puny-looking Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world for 40 years. And when you go up it, it still seems very tall. And when you look down from it, you still think you're very high. This is the Burj Khalifa, which is now opened in Dubai in 2010, and which is, as I mentioned earlier, 2,700 feet high. And it's got offices, and it's got a hotel, and it's got residences and spas and supermarkets and theaters and shops and everything. This building is back on the drawing board. It's called the Kingdom Tower in Jeddah. Carol's got a picture of it somewhere. And there is a developer there with a lot of money who wants to build a building that is taller than his neighboring Emirates building. And so he's got various engineers and architects working on this building. It has had several lives, but it is now active again and may indeed go up. It's a kilometer high, so it's not a mile high, it's a kilometer high. This actually is a mile-high tower that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in 1956. If buildable, it wasn't practicable because you don't have a lot of rental space, and you'll never spend so much money to build something so high if you couldn't rent it out, unless, of course, you were in the Middle East and had all the money in the world and wanted to build something really tall. So everything that people said about this building, never happening, may or may not be true in the long run. So that's the end of my talk, and hopefully you guys learned something.
Answer some questions, which I'm sure you'll
Yeah, sure. You can put the lights on if you want, maybe, so I can see who. Yeah.
Is there any studies done or any inferences about the economic viability of going so tall? For instance, you have this one in Dubai. Is that something that is economically feasible in a place other than Dubai, such as the United States, in terms of, would people want to go up there, and is it expensive to run, and
Right.
do you have any information?
It's funny because the fellow who was the structural engineer on that building told us the other night, I was with dinner with him and Carol and somebody else, that the apartments in this Burj Khalifa sold out right away when they went on the market like that. But, that's sort of the story of Dubai, is that everything sold out right away, but the economy imploded. And when you go there to a lot of these developments, not just the tall developments, there's like nobody living there. So I don't really understand the economics of it. I can tell you that you would not build that building here. Nobody in their right mind would spend that kind of money unless there was some huge anchor tenant that needed that much space. I mean, we can't even find an anchor tenant for big buildings that are on the drawing board here in this city that are ready to go, whether it's in the West Side Yards or at the Hotel Pennsylvania site or other sites. So this is just an enormous amount of space.
It's not an anchored tenant. It's a apartment building.
No, what I'm talking about is you would need somebody to commit. In this country, the developers really work on people making commitments at that size. So you would need somebody to commit to take all of this space before you would go ahead and start entertaining those kinds of construction costs. Because remember, as you get higher, the construction costs get greater because you're pumping cement into the sky, you're bringing steel into the sky, you're bringing systems into the sky, so it's very, very expensive. Yeah.
I'm originally from Boston, though no, I'm not a Red Sox fan. No, I don't even like the city, but I was born in Skyscraper. The John Hancock Tower is the city's tallest building.
Right.
I heard the windows falling. Obviously, I was a baby.
Right.
1972. But I never heard that there were any fatalities or any.
You know what? I don't think so because I didn't actually read about that. I think it was a construction site when the windows fell out. So it wasn't. There weren't people there. It was 1973. So it was before the building was. It was actually 2 or 3 years before the building was open. So I'm assuming that when they fell, it was within some protected area that was under construction.
The building's actually in a commercial area called Copley Square.
Right.
And there's a lot of. I'm assuming it was in the 70s, but I know now there's a lot of industry around there. It's kind of hard to believe that in that area
Yeah.
there would have been no accidents happening.
Right. Well, obviously it was less dense at that time, but it was definitely a cordoned off construction site because I've never heard about anybody being killed by those falling windows either.
One of the fallouts of that at the time, because the glass panels were actually mirrored glass, is that they were saying how many thousands of years of bad luck they would have.
That's interesting. That's funny. Yeah.
Frank Gehry building down here.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any sort of thing, like been told or heard that it's like the residential structure?
In the city. Remember, there's tall residential buildings going up all over the world. She's got a model of one that's going up in Mumbai that's really, really tall.
Really unique about it, other than
The Frank Gehry building? Well, the facade is really very interesting. When you look at there's a lot of interesting things about it technically, but the material and the way that at least I think 2 sides of the building are folded. So the curtain wall or the skin of the building. It's not just that it's a tall residential building, it's the skin of the building that I think really defines it. When you see it from Brooklyn, I saw it the other day with the sun shining on it from Brooklyn, and it was really magic. I mean, you know, it's very, very unusual. From a distance, if you look it up close, sometimes you're like, hey, what's going on? But when you see it from a distance, it can really play with you. Yeah.
You touched on briefly when you talk about the difference between European, Asian, and American skyscrapers. My question is, do you go into that in detail, such as the difference between a residential versus a commercial building in terms of the journey to work, the traffic it generates to the site? I know a lot of the larger ones are mixed use and are trying to generate traffic within,
Right.
such as the Verge, where they have a lot of the things that you would need the building for. They tried to do the Hancock building in Chicago, where having a lot of the uses in New York could not exist. I mean, we couldn't have the density without a mass transit system to bring these people to work. I look at these things here, and I mean, the Emirates are now finally building mass transit. This is actually sort of a logical leap from the previous book on infrastructure.
Right.
Do you touch on the demands that these buildings make in terms of water, transportation, like in their environment?
I don't really go into it in any great detail because this is a fairly, superficial in terms of explaining how things work. But I do talk a little bit about the evolution of the mixed-use building as a typology, as a place where people live and work, because that is what's happening. And you do see it in some parts here. You see it in the Time Warner Center, for example, at Columbus Circle, and that's a pretty successful place where people can shop and do everything without a car. And you see it in these other places. The funny thing about places like Dubai, where the Burj Khalifa, which is here, is they're not very dense. I mean, they're building transit, they're doing all this, but they don't have any traffic. I mean, it's just a whole strange phenomenon because typically skyscrapers are built in places where land values are very, very high, where an awful lot of people want to live. And what's happening in the Middle East and in some parts of India as well, skyscrapers are going up not always in the heart of cities where you have transit and where you can manage those flows of people. So you're getting the buildings before you're getting the infrastructure in some cases, and that's what you're seeing in Dubai. You're seeing it in places like India, and it is problematic, not just for transit. It's problematic for sewage. It's problematic for a whole bunch of things because these buildings are like standalone cities, And if you don't have city services as a developer, you need to provide those services.
Can I add an addendum to that?
Sure.
Because I was talking to your colleague from, I forgot to mention in the introduction that Kate is also a consultant at Happold, which is a consulting firm specialized in engineering. And I was talking to your colleague, the big guy, I forgot who he is, but a mechanical engineer, about who's doing them by tower. Well, one tower, 118-story purely residential building. And he made the point to me that I had never realized before, that the buildings are stuck. You don't need to plug into infrastructure. You don't have to have, Mumbai doesn't have any infrastructure, whether it's sewage, water, electricity, transportation, forget about it. But these buildings are autonomous, like battery packs. I mean, they are...
Well, they have to be where they're being put. That's right.
Yes, right. So actually, these buildings can precede the infrastructure in the city. You don't need an urban infrastructure. That can come afterwards because they're completely autonomous.
Nobody goes anywhere, they just stay in the building.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
They don't go anywhere, they just live their life.
No, they go places, but you have electricity, you have toilets, you have everything else. You got $1 billion.
They can. From an efficiency standpoint, from a climate standpoint, you know, my personal view is that that's not the most brilliant way to build a city by a lot of standalone things that aren't connected because they have all kinds of externalities, but they certainly can. They are like little battery packs.
But the trend now in super talls is residential rather than, say, office buildings, which would generate more traffic towards it and from the building.
Well, the trend is really mixed use. It's both. It's typically both, and that's partly a hedge back to make some sense of community and also to keep these places vibrant 24/7. See how people, yeah.
When I looked at your map of where skyscrapers have been built over the last century, I was struck by the fact that one of the wealthiest parts of the world and where they had great engineering development and have led the world in engineering is Europe. And there are no skyscrapers in all of that
Right.
Civilized part of the world.
Right.
And it must be something about Europe that distinguishes itself, where this audacity that drives these skyscrapers and this desire to shine and be
Right.
brilliant and the best somehow eluded the European mentality.
Yeah, and that's not so much true anymore because today you're seeing, and for, Carol's exhibition here is about super tall, but hold aside super tall because skyscrapers come in all sorts of shapes and sizes that are much different than the ones you're seeing here. These very linear, type buildings. So you do have one of the first green buildings was the Commerzbank building in Germany that was designed by Norman Foster. You're seeing the Shard. You're seeing a ton of skyscrapers go up in London. They're not anywhere near this tall because you're right. There's been height restrictions. There's been an absolute rule that no building should be taller than X. I mean, you name it, St. Paul's, whatever, in different countries. There's been a sense that they didn't want to build tall for a variety of cultural and historical reasons, which I won't go in here. But to some extent, those views are changing. And I think because people's views are changing about suburban sprawl, about density, about the way that you can build communities in an urban setting, you are seeing more skyscrapers go up in Europe. They're just not these kinds of skyscrapers. They're not scraping the sky to the same extent.
Of course.
Yeah.
And there, of course, is one of the greatest tall buildings of history, which is the Eiffel Tower.
Right. Right, and of course the great cathedrals were, European, they reached to the sky in those days. But that was the church, so it was okay. Yeah.
So many of these tall buildings, super tall buildings today are being built in countries that until very recently were second and third world countries. Do you have any concerns about the construction standards in some of these super tall buildings?
Well, I should turn you over to a colleague of mine from Happold who's here to talk about it, or other people, but the architects and the engineers I know that are working on some of these buildings are, look, the architects and engineers that are designing most of them are international, and an awful lot of them are American. So they are holding themselves to the same standards they would hold themselves elsewhere because they're professionals. But the way that the regulations come down from municipal authorities, building codes, and all that stuff in different parts of the world is patchy at best. That's all I can say because I know I've had friends who've been very uncomfortable working in some of these places because they don't know what they're building it to. But I will say that cadre of top architects, top engineers that are around the world working on these buildings have their own set of standards, and I think are working towards those. So it's not much of an answer because I don't know how much one balances out the other, but you should talk to the professionals doing it.
Would you feel comfortable going to the top of these buildings, or have you?
Well, I would feel comfortable. When I was last in Dubai, the Burj was at 120 stories, and I couldn't even see the top. It was in clouds, so I have no desire to go to the top of it. But then again, I don't like heights, so I'm probably the wrong person, and it's nothing to do with the fact that the building's going to fall over. It's like I go up there. I do not want to go to an observation deck and look over. I just don't want to. So there wouldn't be any point in it. I wouldn't buy an apartment at the top either. I feel perfectly comfortable living on the 11th floor, but I don't really need to live on the 88th floor. I don't know. That's just me. Yeah.
There's been some, I guess, failures at bridges over time that have been pretty spectacular.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like that's really ever happened with skyscrapers, has it? And it's sort of following along the same line of, the quality and
Right. It's a really interesting point. I mean, skyscrapers are built to last. They're built to last up to 100 years. And what often happens is they age out because fashions changed and real estate needs change. So it's not like they're there for 200 or 300 years. They're really maintained well during the time they're alive because they're producing revenue. And the minute you stop maintaining a building, you can't keep the rents at the level that you need to support the investment, and so they do tend to they're also maintained privately. So they're money-making machines. Part of the problem with bridges around this country is that there are some bridges that pay their way and are cash cows, and there are other bridges that are free and don't pay anything. And so the maintenance of those bridges can vary dramatically. These buildings tend to be maintained well because they're an investment for most folks. Yeah.
You just read that 100-year mark, like, hey, the skyscraper last 100, like, we're coming up to 100 years, like, a bunch of these. Like, is that like,
well,
time to tear down?
No, not necessarily. My point was more that, they are maintained well for a long period of time, but if you look at what's happening, there's a lot of older buildings that either are now Class B, Class C office space. Some of them have been torn down and replaced by other buildings. Some of them have been retrofitted and renovated. I used to work for Vornado, and they just redid 330 Madison. It's right on the corner of 42nd Street. It looks like a brand new building. They put in all new systems, all new lobby, all new elevators, everything. That's how you keep a building alive and producing revenue. And so those systems are like new. If you swap out all the parts, you basically have a new building. And that's what they do. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah.
You showed that slide where you compared the tall building to urban sprawl, suburban sprawl.
Yeah.
I do see that it's definitely an issue to take all this land, but there's more than just taking land. There's just energy, how you build a building, the energy that is used, the materials, and how you maintain it with energy, right? Sustainability. Is there any mark that you found, like, what's the most economical height to go to? Because I can imagine to a specific height it makes total sense.
Yeah.
But after that,
it's not, there's no real, it's a really good question, but there's no real answer because the energy use of buildings varies dramatically. Depends what kind of skin you put on it, depends who's there, depends, what kind of use the building's being put to. So,
why, for example, the elevators take almost more space?
Correct. So that's why buildings have a natural, cap. So you're absolutely right. It takes more energy to build a tall building. Of course, once you're in a tall building, the energy use of the units within that building tend to be lower because you don't need to heat as much space, and it's easier to heat when you're stacked up as opposed to individual units. So there's lots of things that go into it. It's a really good question, though. Yeah.
Skyscrapers tend to be used in certain cities for image, like Philadelphia, until the mid-'80s had a cap where nothing could be taller than its City Hall building. And
right.
Now it has like the Comcast Tower, Liberty Place. And I've always wondered, a city like Philadelphia that's always been on the brink of economic plus or minus seems to have done it to improve its urban image. Do you agree with the fact that some cities actually allow taller buildings like Philadelphia to attract business?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a statement of power. It's a statement of civic pride. What you're seeing in the Middle East, most of these buildings are going up because somebody's making a statement. It's not because they're making more money that's tall. But those kind of regulations existed in a lot of places. They existed in New York. For a whole bunch of years, you couldn't build taller than Trinity Church, which is, I walk out on our building, at Happold, and I'm on the 23rd floor. I'm pretty even with the top of the steeple of 23, of Trinity Church. That's how tall you could go until the Brooklyn Bridge was built, and then the towers went beyond that. So it's just that maybe some cities come to it later than others. In Hong Kong, one of the stories about the International Commerce Center, that there's a beautiful model of it back there, is that when they first designed it, it was too tall because in Hong Kong, the skyscrapers aren't allowed to go any higher than the mountains that surround the city. So Hong Kong's full of skyscrapers, but even there you get these funny sort of, sometimes they want them taller and sometimes they don't want them to dwarf other things, so it just varies. Yeah.
Well, just a couple of Spire stories, such as Spire, the Spire building on 57th Street.
The City Spire, yeah.
They built too high.
They did.
And the buildings department, the city said you have to, I don't know how it, what machinations went on legally or buildings department or whatever.
Right.
But they had to. And then in Chicago.
And I think it was only something like 4 or 5 feet too tall. It was a really small violation, but yeah.
And the one in Chicago, I was watching the pre-development, and I had mentioned someone that was being built. I didn't know what stage it was at, but since you said it was scrapped, I know that the Trump Tower, one of the, his TV show, or the what's the name of the TV show?
I don't watch TV.
Right, well, one of the winners from Chicago, he was given the building to develop. They had no money for it, and he didn't know it. So that just got built too. I know that's what happened. Whatever the winner's name was, that became his project, unbeknownst to him. So he had to raise all the money for it. There was no leasing.
It's kind of a crazy world out there. Really crazy. But that hole still exists where that building is supposed to be. It's just a hole.
Trump is completely leased out now?
No, well, the Trump building is up, and that's doing well. Next to it is the hole for the Spire, which is doing nothing. It's just a hole. I think that's it.
Can I make?
Well, you're going to make me look stupid because you know so much more than me, so that's...
Well, it's not to contradict or take exception, but to make a point, which actually this exhibition makes regularly, and I make regularly, is the height comparisons prove a little misleading about the history of the skyscraper in terms of its size. Same, we gave a talk for Kate last week, so we're sort of, repeating the same little, not so much a debate, but the distinction. Because I don't think we'll ever have buildings, and this is a bold prediction on my part, I don't think there'll ever be buildings bigger than the World Trade Center, two Twin Towers, the 1960s.
Big in terms of their mass or in terms of their height?
Volume of space.
Volume.
There is not a skyscraper in the world today that is as large or even 3/4 as large as the Sears Tower or the World Trade Center. So the floor plates of those, which are solid all the way up, or larger and diminish as they go up, make 4 million square foot or 4.5 million square feet of rentable space. We have some developers in the audience. We know what kind of space developers like. Not tall space, but space that has a square foot number attached to it and lots of it.
Right.
So there are no buildings in the world today of 4 million square feet that are towers. The Shanghai World Financial Center is about 3 million square feet, and the Tower 1 World Trade Center is 3/4 the size of the building, one of the buildings it replaces. So when we think about tall and scale are entirely different, and I actually think some of your the illustrations are a little bit misleading because they scale up in terms of breadth instead of and height.
Right.
It's something that I know we struggle with all the time.
Right, people are always interested in how tall buildings are. I think it's kind of like, because it's sort of like, they're interested in state capitals, they're interested in church spires, and they're interested in skyscrapers. But actually, skyscraper, I've said it and Carol just said it too, it's an economic unit. It's there to make money. And so you make money by the amount of floor space. You don't make money. Yes, you can rent space on higher floors typically for higher rents. But it's that space that makes you the money, not the height itself.
So if you want to describe the culminating era of the skyscraper, it's 1960s, 1970. I don't think they'll ever get bigger than that, but taller indeed, 1,000 feet taller. But these are very slender, engineered, programmed buildings that have very little content at the top. They stretch themselves out. So it's just
Right.
a really important thing to remember about the distinction
Right.
between the two centuries.
Right, and I happen to think that whether they're big like the Trade Center, or whether they're really tall, like, to me, it's all like what I like to call the edifice complex. It's just about building something bigger than the next person, and it's not, most of those buildings, including the Trade Center, are not just about money. That, you know, they're not just about the economics. They're about other, they're making other statements too. They don't need to be necessarily as big or as
Well,
similar.
actually, Carol, I think the difference is that the World Trade Center was built by an authority.
That's
public
exactly, I was just going to say that.
And they had a totally different
The Sears
responsibility.
Tower was not built by an authority. The Sears Tower in Chicago was not built by an authority, and it was the same size.
Okay, but I do think that the fact that that was built by an authority, they could not have built a tall, slim, prestigious tower. They were interested in truly they wanted to make an impact on the economy and to save Lower Manhattan. They had other goals, and so therefore they wanted to build volume, and they also wanted to do it in a very dramatic way.
Right.
So the Chase building is also a very massive building, which also had a goal of the real estate building. And these buildings, to say they wanted to make money, I find it very difficult to think that that was a primary goal for these developers.
Of these kinds of buildings? Well,
Not those, but those 48 on that wall are built to make money. That's why.
Yeah, but they also had another goal. And
Everybody always has another goal. But nobody's going to lend money to build the buildings unless they believe the profit is going to be made.
it's often,
Longer discussion.
it definitely is a longer discussion. Having worked for a developer, I know it's often both. It's often in part about the money to be made, but it's also about spending extra to make it look good and make a statement. So I think it's complex. Each of them is complex.
So we have the opportunity
Anyway.
to buy a book for a
Thank you.
Christmas present.
You don't have to buy
yourself
one.
And to have it signed. Please take the book to the front or go to the front of the bookstore and buy one there and bring it back for a signature. And join us for some wine and water, and thank Kate for her